In the shadowy halls of Chistone Hall, where ancient walls whisper secrets in the dead of night, Miss Jane Marple arrives to unravel a chilling mystery. Stolen silver, forged deeds, and a family torn by greed. Each clue draws her deeper into a web of deceit. As the murmurs grow louder, Miss Marple's keen eye and quiet wisdom uncover a plot that threatens to destroy an estate and its legacy. Will she silence the whispers before it's too late? Step into a world of hidden passages and human frailties, where nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Chistone Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite chintz-covered armchair by the window of her neat little cottage in St Mary Mead, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of long practice. Outside, the October sunlight cast a golden glow on the garden, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies nodded in the breeze. Her hands, delicate but sure, worked a soft woolen shawl, though her eyes were fixed not on the stitches, but on the letter that lay open on the table beside her. It was written in a fine, tremulous hand, and the crest embossed on the heavy cream paper spoke of old wealth and older traditions. Chistone Hall, a name that stirred faint memories of her youth. The letter was from Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop, a school friend from those distant days when Jane Marple had been a shy girl at a boarding school in Florence. Eleanor, then Eleanor Grayson, had been a lively, golden-haired creature, full of laughter and grand plans. Now, widowed and mistress of Chistone Hall, she seemed a different woman, her words laced with an undercurrent of unease. "My dear Jane," the letter began, "it has been too many years since we last met, and I find myself longing for the company of someone with your calm good sense. Would you consider spending a fortnight at Chistone? The house is too large for me alone, and lately, I confess, I have been troubled by odd occurrences. I should so value your presence." A postscript, added in a hastier scrawl, read, "The walls seem to whisper at night, Jane. I cannot explain it, but it unsettles me." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had always found letters revealing, not just for what they said, but for what they left unsaid. Eleanor's words, polite and measured, carried a plea that piqued her curiosity. Whispering walls. It was the sort of phrase that might be dismissed as fancy, yet Miss Marple knew better than to ignore such hints. In St Mary Mead, she had once heard of a haunted cottage where creaking floorboards had concealed a far more earthly mischief. Her nephew Raymond, with his modern ideas, might call her interest fanciful, but Miss Marple preferred to think of it as an instinct for the unusual. She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements sprightly despite her years. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11:30, and she noted with approval that there was just time to arrange her journey. Chistone Hall was some 30 miles away, in the neighbouring county, a distance easily managed by train and taxi. She rang for her maid, Cherry, a cheerful young woman whose efficiency was matched only by her tendency to gossip. "Cherry," Miss Marple said, adjusting her spectacles, "I shall be going away for a fortnight. Could you fetch my small suitcase from the attic and see to airing my grey tweed? I'll need it for the country." Cherry's eyes widened. "Off on an adventure, Miss Marple. Where to this time?" "Chistone Hall," Miss Marple replied, folding the letter with care. "An old friend has invited me. It's a fine old house, I believe, though perhaps a little grand for my tastes." Cherry grinned. "Sounds like one of them places with ghosts and secret passages. My Jim was reading a book about a house like that last week." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ghosts, Cherry. I rather think it's people who make the most interesting mysteries. Now, about that suitcase." As Cherry bustled off, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to Chistone Hall. She recalled visiting it once, decades ago, when Eleanor's late husband, Sir Henry Winthrop, had been alive. The hall was a rambling Elizabethan manor, its stone facade softened by ivy and its interiors a maze of oak-panelled rooms and winding corridors. Sir Henry had been a proud man, fond of his lineage, but Eleanor had always seemed slightly out of place in that world of ancestral portraits and polished silver. What, Miss Marple wondered, had changed to prompt this urgent invitation? She spent the afternoon preparing, her mind sifting through possibilities. Eleanor's mention of odd occurrences suggested something more tangible than mere nerves. Financial troubles, perhaps. Family disputes. Or something darker, hidden behind the grandeur of Chystone Hall. Miss Marple had learned long ago that great houses, like small villages, were fertile ground for secrets. She packed her suitcase with her usual economy: 2 sensible dresses, a warm cardigan, her best lace cap, and of course, her knitting. One never knew when a quiet hour with needles and wool might yield an unexpected insight. By evening, she had telephoned the station to confirm the morning train and written a brief reply to Eleanor, promising to arrive the following afternoon. As she sipped her bedtime cocoa, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of anticipation. The whispering walls of Chystone Hall were a puzzle, and puzzles, as she had often told her friend Dolly Bantry, were like tangled skeins of wool. With patience, they could always be unravelled. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The train to Chystone rattled through the autumn countryside, its windows framing a patchwork of golden fields and hedgerows tinged with the first frost. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner of the first-class carriage, her hands folded neatly over her small black handbag, her eyes taking in the passing landscape with a quiet alertness. She had always found journeys conducive to thought, the steady rhythm of the wheels allowing her mind to wander over the details of Eleanor Winthrop's letter. The phrase "whispering walls" lingered in her memory, evocative and unsettling, like something from one of Raymond's detective novels. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth behind such mysteries was often less fanciful than it seemed. Human nature, after all, was rarely as complicated as it liked to pretend. At Chystone Station, a small windswept platform bordered by a single tea shop, she was met by a driver in a worn tweed cap. He introduced himself as Tompkins, the estate's handyman, and led her to a polished but aging Bentley. The drive to Chystone Hall wound through lanes flanked by ancient oaks, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the road with shadow. Miss Marple noted the driver's reticence. He answered her polite inquiries about the weather and the estate with monosyllables, his eyes fixed firmly ahead. She did not press him. Servants, she had learned, often saw more than they said, and Tompkins' silence was as telling as any conversation. The hall came into view as they crested a hill, its grey stone towers rising against a sky heavy with clouds. The building was a study in contrasts. Its Elizabethan core, with mullioned windows and weathered gargoyles, was flanked by later additions, Georgian wings, and a Victorian conservatory that gave it a slightly disjointed air, as though the house could not quite decide what it wished to be. Ivy clung to the walls, softening their severity, but the overall effect was one of grandeur, tempered by neglect. The drive was rutted, and the rose beds flanking the entrance were overgrown, their blooms long past their prime. Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed none of this. A house, like a person, revealed its troubles in small ways. The great oak door swung open as the car drew up, and Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop appeared, her slight figure wrapped in a shawl of fine cashmere. Her face, though lined with age, retained the delicate beauty Miss Marple remembered from their youth, but her eyes held a flicker of anxiety that was new. She hurried forward, her hands outstretched. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come." Eleanor's voice was warm but brittle, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. "I cannot tell you how much it means to have you here." Miss Marple took her friend's hands, noting their faint tremble. "It's been too long, Eleanor. she said with a gentle smile, and I could hardly refuse such a kind invitation. Eleanor led her into the hall, a vast space with a vaulted ceiling and a stone fireplace large enough to roast an ox. The air was cool, carrying the faint mustiness of old wood and wax polish. A grand staircase swept upward, its banisters carved with vines and heraldic beasts, and portraits of long-dead Winthrops gazed down with stern disapproval. Miss Marple felt a pang of nostalgia. The house reminded her of Cranley Manor, where a similar air of faded splendour had concealed a most intriguing scandal. "Come, let me introduce you to the household," Eleanor said, guiding her toward a drawing room where a fire crackled in a marble hearth. The room was furnished with heavy brocade chairs and a mahogany table, its surfaces cluttered with silver candlesticks and porcelain figurines. 4 figures awaited them, and Miss Marple's keen gaze took their measure as Eleanor made the introductions. Captain Richard Winthrop, Eleanor's stepson, was a tall man in his late 40s, with the erect posture of a soldier and a face weathered by more than sun and wind. His dark hair was streaked with grey, and his eyes, a piercing blue, held a guarded intensity. He greeted Miss Marple with a firm handshake and a smile that did not quite reach those eyes. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped. "Mother speaks highly of you." The word mother carried a faint edge, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling a young man in St. Mary Mead whose resentment of his stepmother had led to most unfortunate consequences. Lydia Crane, Eleanor's companion, was a woman of perhaps 30, with sharp features and hair the colour of polished chestnut, drawn tightly into a bun. Her dress was modest but well cut, and her movements were quick, almost restless, as she offered Miss Marple a cup of tea. "I've heard you're fond of village life," Lydia said, her tone polite but cool. "Chystone must seem terribly grand by comparison." Miss Marple smiled, sensing a challenge beneath the words. Lydia's eyes darted toward Richard, then away, a gesture so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant guest. Dr. Hugh Baxter, the local physician, was a stout man with a florid complexion and a hearty manner that seemed designed to put others at ease. His tweed suit was slightly rumpled, and his tie bore a faint stain, suggesting a man more concerned with his patients than his appearance. "Delighted to meet you, Miss Marple," he boomed, shaking her hand with enthusiasm. "Eleanor tells me you're a bit of a sleuth. We could use one here, with all the odd goings-on." He laughed, but his eyes lingered on Eleanor, and Miss Marple wondered if his frequent visits to the hall were entirely professional. The final member of the party was Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, a gaunt woman with a face like a closed book. Her black dress was immaculate, and her grey hair was pinned with military precision. She said little, offering only a curt nod when introduced, but her eyes followed every movement in the room. Miss Marple recognised the type at once, a servant who knew more than she would ever volunteer, much like old Mrs. Jenkins in St. Mary Mead, whose silence had once unmasked a thief. Tea was served, and the conversation turned to the weather, the state of the roads, and the decline of the local hunt, all safe topics that allowed Miss Marple to observe her companions. Richard spoke little, his attention fixed on a newspaper, though his fingers drummed restlessly on the arm of his chair. Lydia's attempts at small talk were strained, and she spilled a drop of tea when Eleanor mentioned the estate's upkeep. Dr. Baxter filled the silences with anecdotes about his patients, but his joviality seemed forced, as though he were playing a part. Mrs. Gibbs, meanwhile, moved about the room with the efficiency of a shadow, clearing cups and adjusting cushions. As the afternoon waned, Eleanor drew Miss Marple aside, leading her to a window that overlooked the sunken garden. The light was fading, and the clouds had thickened, casting the lawn in a sombre grey. "Jane," Eleanor said, her voice low, "I didn't want to alarm you in my letter, But I'm at my wit's end. The whispers, they come at night, from the walls themselves. Murmurs, sometimes words, though I can't make them out. Richard says it's the wind in the chimneys, but I know this house. It's not the wind. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but searching. Have you heard anything specific, Eleanor? A phrase, perhaps, or a tone? Eleanor shook her head, twisting the fringe of her shawl. It's indistinct, like voices in a dream, but it's always in the east wing, near the old library. I've tried to investigate, but the corridors are so dark, and I'm not as brave as I once was. Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. You were brave enough to write to me, my dear. That's a start. Tell me, has anything else unusual happened? Visitors, perhaps, or changes in the household? Eleanor hesitated. Nothing specific, though Richard has been distant. He's always been a difficult boy, but lately he's been pressing to sell the hall. He says it's too costly to maintain, and perhaps he's right, but this is my home. And Lydia, she's a good girl, but she's been nervous, dropping things, forgetting her duties. I wonder if she's hiding something. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a nervous maid had been the key to unravelling a web of deceit. And Dr. Baxter, she prompted. Oh, Hugh's a dear, Eleanor said, a faint smile breaking through her worry. He's been a great comfort since Henry died. He dines here often, though I suspect he's more interested in the claret than in me. She laughed, but it was a fragile sound, and Miss Marple sensed the effort behind it. As they returned to the drawing room, the wind rose outside, rattling the windows and sending a draught through the room. The fire flared, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and for a moment, Miss Marple imagined she heard a faint murmur, like a voice carried on the breeze. She dismissed it as fancy, but her curiosity deepened. Walls, she knew, could hold secrets as surely as people did, and she resolved to listen carefully to both. Dinner was a formal affair, served in a dining room lined with dark panelling and lit by a chandelier that gleamed with the patina of age. The meal, roast pheasant, potatoes dauphinoise, and a rather overcooked parsnip puree, was excellent, though Miss Marple noted that the silver was slightly tarnished and the napkins bore faint stains. Mrs. Gibbs presided over the service with a hawkish eye, while a young maid, introduced as Nellie, moved nervously, nearly dropping a tureen of gravy. Richard ate in silence, his fork scraping the plate with unnecessary force. Lydia picked at her food, her eyes darting to the windows as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. Dr. Baxter, by contrast, was voluble, regaling them with tales of his youth in London, though Miss Marple noticed he avoided any mention of the hall's recent troubles. After dinner, the party retired to the drawing room for coffee. Miss Marple, pleading fatigue, excused herself early, eager to explore the house alone. Her room, on the second floor of the east wing, was a cosy chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the moors. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of roses, was peeling at the edges, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. She unpacked her suitcase, placing her knitting on the bedside table, and sat for a moment listening. The house was quiet, save for the distant howl of the wind and the occasional groan of settling timbers. No whispers yet, but Miss Marple was patient. She changed into her nightgown, her movements deliberate, and slipped into bed, her mind turning over the day's observations. Richard's tension, Lydia's unease, Dr. Baxter's forced cheer, Mrs. Gibbs's watchful silence. Each was a thread in a tapestry that was only beginning to take shape. And Eleanor, poor Eleanor, caught in the centre, her fear of the whispering walls a symptom of something deeper. Miss Marple thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a widow's anxiety had masked a plot to rob her of her inheritance. Could something similar be afoot here? She closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting to the east wing and the library Eleanor had mentioned. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin her exploration there. For now, she let the silence of Chistone Hall envelop her, knowing that silence, like whispers, could speak volumes to those who knew how to listen. Chapter 3. The First Clue. The morning after her arrival at Chistone Hall, Miss Jane Marple rose early, her habits as punctual as the village clock in St. Mary Mead. The air in her room was crisp, the fire having died to embers overnight, and she dressed with care, choosing a grey tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that lent her an air of unassuming respectability. From her window, the moors stretched toward the horizon, their muted greens and browns softened by a thin mist. The sight reminded her of a painting she had once seen at a neighbour's house, though that particular landscape had concealed a rather unpleasant surprise. She smiled to herself, adjusted her lace cap, and made her way downstairs, her soft-soled shoes silent on the worn oak treads. Breakfast was served in a smaller dining room, its walls hung with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, their colours faded but still evocative of a grander era. Eleanor was already seated, her face pale against the dark velvet of her chair, stirring a cup of tea with a distracted air. Richard entered moments later, his boots clattering on the floor, his expression as stormy as the clouds outside. Lydia followed, her eyes shadowed, as though she had slept poorly, and Dr. Baxter, who had apparently stayed the night, greeted Miss Marple with a hearty "Good morning" that seemed to jar the room's quiet mood. Mrs. Gibbs supervised the serving of kedgeree and toast, her presence as unobtrusive as it was watchful. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the dynamics at the table. Richard's curt responses to Eleanor's attempts at conversation suggested a rift deeper than mere impatience. Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she buttered her toast, and she avoided looking at Richard, though her glances toward Dr. Baxter were frequent and fleeting. The doctor, for his part, seemed determined to keep the mood light, regaling them with a story about a patient who mistook a cow's bellow for a ghostly wail. Miss Marple listened politely, her mind cataloguing every gesture, every inflection. She had seen such breakfasts before, in houses where tension simmered beneath the surface, like the time in St. Mary Mead when a family's strained silences had hinted at a theft. After breakfast, Eleanor suggested a tour of the grounds, but Miss Marple demurred, citing a desire to explore the house. "Old houses have such character," she said, her voice mild. "I should like to see the library, if I may. I'm rather fond of books." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, her fingers tightening on her teacup. "Of course, Jane. It's in the East Wing. Lydia can show you." Lydia rose with a strained smile, and Miss Marple followed her through a series of corridors, their walls lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their progress. The air grew cooler as they approached the East Wing, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of damp stone, a sign of poor maintenance. The library, when they reached it, was a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling shelves, their contents a mix of leather-bound volumes and more recent paperbacks. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a pair of tarnished candelabra. The windows, tall and narrow, admitted a feeble light, and the room felt heavy with the weight of centuries. Lydia lingered by the door, her hands clasped tightly. "It's a bit gloomy, isn't it?" she said, her voice too bright. "I don't come here often. Too many spiders." She gestured toward a desk in the corner, where a ledger lay open, its pages filled with columns of figures. "Just some accounts I was checking. Nothing interesting." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the ledger for a moment before she smiled. "Household accounts can be quite revealing, my dear. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a housekeeper whose ledgers told a story far more interesting than any novel." She moved toward a shelf, running her fingers lightly over the spines. "Have you worked for Mrs. Winthrop long?" 2 years, Lydia replied, her tone guarded. "She's very kind. It's a good position. She shifted her weight, her eyes darting to the ledger, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush on her cheeks. The girl was nervous, and Miss Marple suspected it was not merely the gloom of the library that caused it. Left alone after Lydia's hasty departure, Miss Marple examined the room more closely. The ledger she saw was indeed a record of household expenses, but the entries were irregular, with sums crossed out and rewritten in a hurried hand. She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through Mrs. Gibbs, who seemed the sort to know every penny spent in the house. Moving to the windows, she tested the latches, finding them stiff but functional. A faint draught stirred the heavy curtains, and she wondered if the whispers Eleanor had mentioned might be caused by air moving through unseen cracks. Yet the walls themselves seemed solid, their panels carved with intricate patterns that suggested age rather than decay. Her exploration was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the corridor. Stepping lightly to the door, she peered out, catching sight of Richard and Dr. Baxter near a staircase. Richard's voice was low but sharp. "You've no business meddling, Hugh. Keep to your pills and potions." Dr. Baxter's reply was inaudible, but his gesture, a raised hand, placating yet firm, suggested a man accustomed to diffusing tempers. Miss Marple slipped back into the library, her mind turning over the exchange. Richard's defensiveness was intriguing, and she recalled a young man in her village whose anger had masked a guilty conscience. Later, at luncheon, Eleanor seemed more composed, though her eyes strayed often to the windows, where rain had begun to patter against the glass. The meal was simple, cold meats and a salad, but Miss Marple noted the absence of the silver salt cellars she had seen at dinner the previous night. When she remarked on their beauty, Eleanor's face clouded. "They've gone missing," she said quietly. "Mrs. Gibbs thinks they were misplaced during polishing, but I'm not so sure. Small things have been vanishing lately. A brooch, a pair of cufflinks. It's most unsettling." Miss Marple's expression was one of polite concern, but her mind was racing. Theft in a great house was not uncommon, but the timing, coupled with the whispers, suggested a pattern. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where missing trinkets had pointed to a servant's desperation, though here the stakes seemed higher. "How tiresome," she said, her voice soothing. "Perhaps they'll turn up. Things often do, in my experience." The afternoon passed quietly, with Eleanor retiring for a rest and Richard disappearing to the stables. Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak with Mrs. Gibbs, finding her in the pantry counting linens. The housekeeper's face was as unyielding as granite, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence coaxed a few details. "The salt cellars were sterling, miss," Mrs. Gibbs said, her lips thinning. "Worth a pretty penny. And that brooch, Mrs. Winthrop's mother's, set with garnets. I've searched every cupboard, but they're gone. Thieves, I reckon, though how they got in beats me." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Houses like this have so many nooks and crannies. In my village, we once lost a silver teapot, only to find it in a guest room, tucked behind a curtain. Have you checked the east wing thoroughly?" Mrs. Gibbs's eyes narrowed slightly. "The east wing's mostly shut up, miss. No one goes there but Miss Crane, for her accounts, and the maids for dusting. But I'll have another look." Her tone suggested scepticism, but Miss Marple sensed she would follow through, if only to prove her own diligence. That evening, as the household gathered for drinks before dinner, Miss Marple observed a shift in the atmosphere. Richard was absent, having ridden into the village, and Lydia seemed more at ease, though her laughter at Dr. Baxter's jokes was brittle. Eleanor, fortified by a glass of sherry, spoke of her plans to restore the rose garden, but her enthusiasm faltered when a sudden gust rattled the windows. "There it is again," she murmured, her hand tightening on her glass. "The whispers." Miss Marple tilted her head, listening. The sound was faint, a sibilant murmur that might have been the wind, but carried an oddly human cadence. It seemed to come from the direction of the east wing, and she made a mental note to investigate further. "How curious," she said lightly. "Old houses do have their voices, don't they? In St. Mary Mead, we had a cottage where the chimneys sang on stormy nights, quite eerie, until one understood the cause." Eleanor managed a weak smile, but Lydia's face paled, and Dr. Baxter quickly changed the subject to the local cricket team. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, her thoughts elsewhere. The missing silver, the whispers, Richard's temper, Lydia's nerves, all were pieces of a puzzle, and she felt the familiar thrill of fitting them together. She resolved to visit the East Wing again, perhaps at night, when the house was still and secrets were more likely to reveal themselves. As she retired to her room, the wind howled louder, and the murmurs seemed to follow her up the stairs. She paused, her hand on the banister, and listened. The sound was elusive, fading as quickly as it came, but it left her with a certainty. The whispering walls of Chistone Hall were speaking, and Miss Marple intended to understand their message. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Doubt. The morning light crept through the heavy curtains of Miss Marple's room, casting a soft glow on the faded rose wallpaper. She rose with her customary alertness, her mind already turning over the threads of the mystery at Chistone Hall. The whispers Eleanor had described, the missing silver, Lydia's nervous demeanour, and Richard's barely concealed hostility formed a pattern, though its shape remained elusive. As she pinned her lace cap and smoothed her navy dress, Miss Marple reflected that mysteries, like her knitting, required patience to untangle. A single dropped stitch could unravel the whole, and she sensed that the key to Chistone's secrets lay close at hand. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Eleanor absent, nursing a headache, and Richard absent altogether, reportedly inspecting the estate's tenants. Lydia sat opposite Miss Marple, her fingers crumbling a piece of toast, her eyes fixed on her plate. Dr. Baxter, who had arrived early to check on Eleanor, filled the silence with talk of the village fete, but his joviality seemed strained, as though he sensed the undercurrents in the room. Mrs. Gibbs moved silently, serving kippers and tea, her face as unreadable as ever. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the absence of another silver item, a sugar tongs that had been present the previous day. She made no comment, but filed the observation away, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead where a series of small thefts had pointed to a far larger crime. After breakfast, Miss Marple proposed a walk in the grounds, hoping to draw Lydia into conversation, but the young woman pleaded a prior engagement with the household accounts. Dr. Baxter offered to accompany her instead, and they set out toward the sunken garden, where the air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The doctor's stride was brisk, his hands clasped behind his back, and Miss Marple matched his pace, her small figure belying her endurance. "You've a keen eye, Miss Marple," Dr. Baxter said as they passed a row of overgrown yews. "Eleanor says you've a knack for solving puzzles. Ever come across anything like these whispers she's on about?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Not precisely, though old houses often have their quirks. In my village we had a manor where strange noises turned out to be a loose shutter, but Eleanor seems convinced there's more to it." She paused, noting the doctor's slight frown. "You've known the family long, I understand. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Dr. Baxter hesitated, his ruddy face clouding. "Eleanor's been under strain since Sir Henry died. This business with the estate, it's too much for her. Richard's keen to sell, you know, and she's dead set against it. Causes friction." He glanced at Miss Marple, as though weighing how much to say. "As for the whispers, I'd wager it's the wind. These old piles are full of draughts." Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign, but she noted the doctor's quick dismissal of the whispers. He was protective of Eleanor, perhaps too much so, and she wondered if his frequent visits were motivated by more than professional duty. They completed their circuit of the garden in companionable silence, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. The doctor's words confirmed what Eleanor had hinted at: a battle over Chistone's future, with Richard at its heart. But what role did Lydia play? And why were small valuables disappearing? Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Gibbs, finding her in the still room sorting jars of preserves. The housekeeper's movements were precise, her apron spotless, but her eyes held a wariness that Miss Marple recognised from years of observing human nature. "Mrs. Gibbs," she began, her tone conversational, "you must find it a challenge managing such a large house. I noticed the sugar tongs were missing this morning. Have they been misplaced as well?" Mrs. Gibbs's hands stilled, and she met Miss Marple's gaze with a flicker of surprise. "You don't miss much, do you, miss?" "Aye, the tongs are gone, and a silver cigarette case from the drawing room too. I've had Nellie turn out every cupboard, but there's no sign of them. It's not like the old days when you could trust everyone under your roof." Miss Marple's smile was sympathetic. "It's most vexing. In St. Mary Mead, we had a similar trouble once. A locket vanished from a guest's room. It turned up in the most unexpected place, but not before causing quite a stir. Have you any new staff who might be less reliable?" Mrs. Gibbs shook her head. "Just Nellie, and she's green but honest. Been with us 6 months. The others, Tompkins, the maids, they've been here years. If you ask me, it's someone from outside sneaking in. Though how they're managing it, with the doors locked at night, I can't fathom." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Locked doors did not always deter thieves, especially if they were already inside the house. She thanked Mrs. Gibbs and made her way to the library, determined to examine it more thoroughly. The room was as she had left it, its air heavy with the scent of old books and wax. She moved to the desk, where the ledger still lay, its pages now closed. Opening it carefully, she scanned the entries, noting discrepancies in the sums, purchases for coal and candles recorded twice, with different amounts. It was the sort of error an inexperienced bookkeeper might make, but Lydia, she suspected, was not inexperienced. Her inspection was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats on the drive. Peering through the window, she saw Richard dismounting from a bay mare, his face set in a scowl. Moments later, Lydia appeared from the direction of the stables, her coat flecked with mud. The two exchanged words, their voices low but heated, and Miss Marple watched as Richard gestured sharply, his hands slicing the air. Lydia's shoulders stiffened, and she turned away, her face flushed. The encounter was brief but telling, and Miss Marple stored it away, recalling a young couple in her village whose clandestine meetings had revealed a plot to deceive. That afternoon, over tea in the drawing room, Eleanor rejoined them. Her headache eased, but her spirits still fragile. She spoke of her plans to host a small gathering for the village, a tradition Sir Henry had cherished, but her voice faltered when Richard entered, his boots leaving faint traces of mud on the carpet. "You'll bankrupt us with these fancies, Eleanor," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "The estate's bleeding money as it is." Eleanor's lips trembled, but she held her ground. "Chistone is my home, Richard. I'll not see it sold off to strangers." Miss Marple, stirring her tea, observed the exchange with interest. Richard's insistence on selling was more than financial pragmatism. There was a desperation in his eyes that suggested personal stakes. Lydia, seated near the fire, kept her gaze on her hands, but her fingers twisted a handkerchief into knots. Dr. Baxter, attempting to lighten the mood, suggested a game of bridge, but the suggestion fell flat, and the group dispersed soon after. As evening approached, Miss Marple took advantage of the quiet to explore the east wing further. The corridors were dimly lit, their shadows deepening as the sun sank below the moors. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the walls for signs of irregularity. Near a faded tapestry depicting a hunt, she paused, her fingers brushing the fabric. It was heavier than it looked, and when she lifted it, she found a panel of wood slightly misaligned with its neighbours. Pressing gently, she felt a faint give, but the panel did not move. She made a mental note to return with a tool, perhaps a knitting needle, to test it further. Dinner that night was tense, with Richard's mood casting a pall over the table. The meal, lamb cutlets and creamed spinach, was served without the usual silver accompaniments, and Miss Marple noted Mrs. Gibbs's tight-lipped expression as she supervised Nellie. Afterward, as the household retired to the drawing room, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need for rest. Instead, she slipped into the east wing, her torch casting a narrow beam on the stone walls. The tapestry was as she had left it, and she pressed the panel again, this time with more force. There was a soft click, and the panel shifted, revealing a narrow gap. Her heart quickened, but footsteps in the corridor forced her to retreat, her torch extinguished. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The panel suggested a secret passage, a feature not uncommon in houses like Chistone. She thought of a manor in St. Mary Mead where a hidden room had concealed stolen goods, and she wondered what Chistone's walls might hide. The whispers, the thefts, Richard's urgency to sell, Lydia's anxiety, all were linked, she was certain, and the passage might hold the answer. As she prepared for bed, the wind rose outside, and she strained to hear the murmurs Eleanor had described. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, a sibilant echo from the heart of the house. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the dark. The shadow of doubt had fallen over Chistone Hall, and she was determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 5. The Midnight Discovery. The clock in Miss Marple's room struck 11, its chime muffled by the heavy drapes and the distant howl of the wind outside Chistone Hall. She sat by the window, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkened moors. The events of the day, the missing sugar tongs, Richard's heated exchange with Lydia, the hidden panel behind the tapestry, had woven themselves into a tapestry of suspicion, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation that came with a puzzle nearing its resolution. The whispers Eleanor had described, elusive yet persistent, were no mere fancy, she was certain. They were a clue, and tonight she intended to follow it. She rose, her movements quiet but deliberate, and exchanged her lavender cardigan for a dark shawl that would blend with the shadows. From her knitting bag, she retrieved a small torch and a sturdy steel knitting needle, its tip blunt but firm enough to serve as a makeshift tool. Slipping on her soft-soled shoes, she opened her door and stepped into the corridor, where the air was cool and carried the faint scent of beeswax and age. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling timbers, and Miss Marple moved with the stealth of long practice, her slight figure gliding along the oak-panelled walls. The east wing was her destination, its corridors a labyrinth of shadows cast by the flickering sconces. She navigated by memory, avoiding the main staircase where Mrs. Gibbs or Nellie might be making a final round. Her torch beam danced across the walls, picking out the stern faces of Winthrop ancestors in their gilded frames. She paused at the tapestry she had examined earlier, its hunting scene barely visible in the dim light. Lifting it carefully, she found the misaligned panel and pressed it with the knitting needle. The wood yielded with a soft click, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for a single person. Miss Marple hesitated, her heart beating a little faster. She was no stranger to such discoveries. St. Mary Mead had its share of old houses with hidden nooks, but the darkness of the passage was daunting, even to her. Yet curiosity, that old and faithful companion, urged her forward. She stepped inside, the torch casting a pale circle of light on the rough stone walls. The air was musty, tinged with the scent of earth and something sweeter, almost floral. Lavender, she realized, recalling the faint perfume she had detected in the corridor the previous night. It was an odd detail, for none in the household used such a scent, and she tucked it away for later consideration. The passage sloped downward, its floor uneven underfoot, and Miss Marple moved slowly, mindful of her footing. After a dozen steps, it widened into a small chamber, its walls lined with wooden shelves that sagged under the weight of dusty ledgers and mildewed papers. In the centre stood a locked chest, its iron bands tarnished but sturdy. The torchlight revealed scratches around the lock, as though someone had recently tampered with it. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the chest. It was old, likely as old as the house itself, and its lock was of a simple design, easily picked by someone with the right tools or determination. Before she could investigate further, a faint sound reached her ears. A rustle, followed by the soft scrape of a footstep. She switched off her torch and pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. The darkness was absolute, but her senses were sharp, honed by years of quiet observation. The footsteps grew closer, and a faint light flickered at the passage's entrance. A figure entered the chamber, moving with hurried purpose, and Miss Marple recognized the silhouette of Lydia Crane. Her chestnut hair loosened from its usual bun. The young woman carried a candle, its flame casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. Lydia knelt by the chest, producing a small key from her pocket. With trembling hands, she unlocked it and lifted the lid, revealing a bundle of papers tied with a ribbon. She untied the bundle, her movements frantic, and scanned the documents, muttering to herself. "It's here it must be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple strained to see, but the angle was wrong, and she dared not move. Lydia selected a single sheet, folded it, and slipped it into her sleeve before closing the chest and relocking it. She stood, her candle wavering, and hurried back into the passage, leaving the chamber in darkness once more. Miss Marple waited, counting to 60 to ensure Lydia was gone, then switched on her torch. Her mind raced as she approached the chest. The lock was indeed simple, and she considered using her knitting needle to probe it, but caution prevailed. Whatever Lydia had taken, it was significant, and Miss Marple had no wish to leave traces of her own presence. Instead, she examined the ledgers on the shelves, their pages brittle with age. Most were estate records, crop yields, tenant rents, but one caught her eye. A slim volume labelled Chistone Deeds, 1850–1900. She opened it, careful not to crack the spine, and found entries detailing land sales and boundaries. Several pages had been torn out, their jagged edges suggesting recent removal. The discovery confirmed her suspicions. The whispers, the thefts. And now the papers were part of a larger scheme, one that likely centered on Chistone's future. She replaced the ledger and retraced her steps, closing the panel behind the tapestry with care. The house was still as she returned to her room, but the silence felt charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Settling into her armchair, Miss Marple reviewed the night's findings. Lydia's furtive actions suggested guilt, but her trembling hands and whispered words hinted at fear rather than cunning. Was she acting alone or under someone's influence? Richard's name came to mind, his desperation to sell the estate a constant refrain. Yet Dr. Baxter's presence and his quick dismissal of the whispers nagged at her, and the lavender scent. Where did it fit? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a perfume had been the key to identifying a culprit, and she resolved to inquire discreetly about the household's habits. As she prepared for bed, the wind rattled the windows, and the faint murmurs returned, drifting from the direction of the east wing. Miss Marple listened, her eyes thoughtful. The passage explained the whispers. Voices carried through the stone, amplified by the house's ancient architecture, but not their purpose. Someone was using the hidden chamber, and the papers Lydia had taken were likely the heart of the matter. She thought of Eleanor, her friend's anxiety, a mirror to the house's unease, and felt a surge of determination. The midnight discovery had brought her closer to the truth, but the puzzle was far from solved. Tomorrow, she would watch Lydia closely, and perhaps find a way to glimpse those papers. For now, she slipped into bed, her mind as alert as ever, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of Chystone Hall. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Chystone Hall, casting a pallid light across the breakfast room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her hands folded neatly over her napkin. The events of the previous night, the hidden passage, Lydia's furtive retrieval of the papers, the torn pages in the old ledger, had sharpened her focus, and she felt the quiet thrill of a mystery nearing its crux. Her face, serene and unassuming, gave no hint of her thoughts as she sipped her tea, but her eyes missed nothing. The faint tremor in Eleanor's hand as she poured cream, the way Lydia avoided meeting anyone's gaze, the restless energy in Richard's movements as he pushed his plate aside, barely touched. The meal was a quiet affair, with Dr. Baxter absent, called away to a patient in the village, and Mrs. Gibbs overseeing the service with her usual silent efficiency. Eleanor attempted to draw Richard into conversation about the estate's orchards, but his responses were curt, his attention fixed on a letter he had received that morning. Miss Marple noted the envelope, its crest unfamiliar but official-looking, tucked into his pocket as he rose abruptly and left the room. Lydia, too, excused herself soon after, murmuring something about correspondence, and Miss Marple sensed an opportunity. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and she resolved to bring them into the open before the day's end. After breakfast, she sought out Eleanor in the morning room, a cosy space with chintz curtains and a view of the mist-shrouded moors. Eleanor was seated at a writing desk, her pen poised over a half-finished letter, her face etched with worry. "Jane," she said, looking up, "I'm so glad you're here. I hardly slept last night. Those whispers again. They seemed louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "It's a troubling thing, Eleanor, but I believe we're close to understanding it. Old houses, have ways of amplifying secrets. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a vicarage where odd noises led us to a most surprising discovery." Her tone was soothing, but her words were chosen with care, planting the seed of a revelation. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think there's something to it, then? Not just the wind?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that we should gather the household this afternoon and discuss what I've found. Would you mind calling everyone to the drawing room after luncheon? Say, at 3 o'clock? Eleanor nodded, her anxiety tempered by trust in her friend's quiet authority. Miss Marple spent the morning in the library, ostensibly reading a volume of local history, but in truth observing the household's movements. Richard returned from a ride, his face set in a scowl, and disappeared into his study. Lydia was seen briefly in the corridor, clutching a bundle of papers, her steps hurried. Mrs. Gibbs, ever vigilant, polished the banisters with a fierceness that suggested she was working off some private frustration. Miss Marple's mind turned over the facts: the hidden passage, the missing silver, the torn ledger, and Lydia's nocturnal visit. The lavender scent still puzzled her, but she suspected it would prove significant. Luncheon was a tense affair, with Richard's mood casting a shadow over the table. The meal, cold salmon and cucumber salad, was served without incident, though Miss Marple noted the absence of yet another silver item. a small tray that had held biscuits the previous day. She caught Mrs. Gibbs's eye, and the housekeeper's slight nod confirmed that the loss had been noticed. Eleanor, pale but composed, mentioned the planned gathering, and Richard's frown deepened, though he made no objection. Lydia's fork clattered against her plate, and she murmured an apology, her cheeks flushed. At 3 o'clock, the household assembled in the drawing-room, the fire casting a warm glow against the gathering dusk. Eleanor sat by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly, while Richard stood by the window, his arms crossed. Lydia perched on the edge of a chair, her eyes darting nervously, and Dr. Baxter, who had returned from the village, leaned against the mantel, his expression one of wary curiosity. Mrs. Gibbs stood near the door, her presence a silent reminder of her authority over the household's routines. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, her knitting in her lap, began to speak, her voice soft but commanding attention. "My dear Eleanor," she said, "you invited me here because of the whispers in the walls, and I've taken it upon myself to look into the matter. What I've found suggests that the trouble at Chiston Hall is not supernatural, but all too human." She paused, letting her words settle, and noted the flicker of unease on Lydia's face, the tightening of Richard's jaw. She continued, her tone measured. "Last night I discovered a hidden passage in the east wing, behind a tapestry near the library. It leads to a chamber containing old ledgers and a locked chest. The whispers, I believe, are voices carried through these passages, amplified by the stone walls. Old houses, as I've seen in my village, often have such quirks, but they are rarely used for innocent purposes." Eleanor gasped, her hand rising to her throat. A passage? But who? Miss Marple's eyes moved to Lydia, who had gone very still. "Miss Crane, you were in that chamber last night. I saw you take a paper from the chest, a paper you seemed anxious to conceal. Would you care to explain?" Lydia's face drained of colour, and she gripped the arms of her chair. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her words were firm. "I think you do, my dear. The chest contained documents, and I found a ledger with missing pages, pages that likely relate to the estate. The missing silver, too, suggests a need for funds, perhaps to support a scheme. And then there's the lavender scent in the passage, which I've not noticed on anyone in the household. It's a small detail, but in my experience, small details matter." Richard stepped forward, his voice sharp. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple. You're accusing Lydia of what? Stealing? Forgery? Based on some old passage and a smell?" "Not accusing, Captain Winthrop," Miss Marple said calmly. "Merely observing. But let us consider the facts. The estate is in financial difficulty, and you've been eager to sell it against Eleanor's wishes. Miss Crane has been handling the accounts, and I've seen discrepancies in the ledgers. The missing silver could fetch a tidy sum, and the papers in that chest, perhaps they're deeds or contracts that would facilitate a sale." Lydia broke, her voice rising in a sob. "It wasn't my idea. I didn't want to do it." She buried her face in her hands, and the room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. "Richard made me. He said we could save the estate, sell off some land to a developer. The papers were forged deeds to make it look legal. I took them to check to make sure they were safe. I didn't want to steal, but he said it was the only way." Richard's face darkened, and he took a step toward her, but Dr. Baxter moved swiftly, placing himself between them. "Enough, Richard," the doctor said, his voice low but firm. "Let her speak." Lydia's words tumbled out, her voice choked with tears. The silver was sold to pay for the forgeries. Richard knew a man in London who could do it. The whispers. You heard us talking in the passage, planning it. I wanted to stop, but he said we'd lose everything if we didn't go through with it. Eleanor's face was ashen. "Richard, is this true?" He stood rigid, His hands clenched, then turned away, his silence as damning as a confession. Miss Marple watched him, her mind recalling a young man in St. Mary Mead who had forged a will to secure his inheritance. The parallels were striking, but she felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for the pain such schemes caused. Dr. Baxter spoke, his tone heavy. "I suspected something was amiss, Eleanor, but I didn't know the extent of it. I've seen Richard's debts piling up. Gambling mostly. I thought he was just pressing to sell for money. Not this." Miss Marple nodded. "The lavender, I suspect, was used to mask the musty smell of the passage, a precaution to avoid detection. A small thing, but it betrayed the secrecy." She turned to Lydia, her voice gentle. "You've done the right thing by speaking, my dear. It's not too late to make amends." The confrontation ended with Eleanor's quiet resolve. She would contact her solicitor to verify the deeds and halt any illicit sale. Richard, faced with exposure, said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. Lydia, still trembling, agreed to provide the forged documents, her relief palpable despite her fear. Miss Marple, her part played, retired to her room, leaving the household to grapple with the truth. The whispers, she knew, would soon cease, but the scars they left would linger. Chapter 7. The Resolution. The morning after the confrontation in the drawing room dawned clear, the heavy clouds that had shrouded Chystone Hall giving way to a pale autumn sun. Miss Jane Marple sat at her bedroom window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her thoughts were far from the soft wool in her hands. The events of the previous day, Lydia's tearful confession, Richard's silent admission of guilt, and Eleanor's quiet determination, had brought the mystery of the whispering walls into sharp focus. Yet, as Miss Marple knew from long experience, the unravelling of a scheme was only the beginning of setting things right. Human nature, with its tangle of motives and regrets, required careful handling to restore peace. Breakfast was a sombre affair, served in the small dining room with its faded tapestries. Eleanor presided with a fragile dignity, her eyes shadowed but resolute. Richard was absent, having left at dawn, according to Mrs. Gibbs, who delivered the news with a tight-lipped expression that suggested no love lost. Lydia, pale and subdued, ate little, her hands folded in her lap as though seeking forgiveness in stillness. Dr. Baxter, present to offer Eleanor support, spoke in low tones about a patient's recovery, but his usual heartiness was tempered by the gravity of the situation. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the group with her customary quiet alertness, noting the absence of the silver butter dish that had graced the table earlier in her stay. Its loss, she suspected, was another casualty of Richard's desperate plan. After breakfast, Eleanor invited Miss Marple to her private sitting room, a snug space adorned with watercolours of the moors and a small bookshelf of well-worn novels. The fire crackled cheerfully, but Eleanor's face was drawn as she sat, her hands clasped tightly. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "I cannot thank you enough. If you hadn't come, I might never have known what Richard was planning. Those forged deeds. How could he betray Chystone like that?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression gentle but firm. "People do surprising things when they feel cornered, Eleanor. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young man who altered a will to secure his future. He thought it his only way out, much like Richard. But you've acted swiftly, and that's what matters." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've telephoned Mr. Hargreaves, my solicitor, this morning. He's coming this afternoon to examine the documents Lydia provided. She's been so contrite, Jane. She gave me everything. The forged deeds, even the names of the men Richard dealt with in London. I can't help but pity her." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Pity is a good start, my dear. Lydia was caught in a difficult position, but her honesty now speaks well of her. She may yet make amends. The conversation turned to practical matters. Eleanor had resolved to keep Chistone Hall despite its financial burdens and was considering letting rooms to boarders to ease the strain. Miss Marple approved, recalling a widow in her village who had turned her home into a guest house with surprising success. "It's a fine house," she said, "and with a little care, it could be a home again, not just a burden." By midday, Mr. Hargreaves arrived, a wiry man with a precise manner and a briefcase bulging with papers. Miss Marple joined Eleanor and Lydia in the library, where the solicitor spread the forged deeds across the desk. His examination was swift but thorough, his pince-nez glinting as he confirmed their falsity. "These are clever forgeries," he said, his voice dry, "but they wouldn't have held up in court. The original deeds are safe in my office, Mrs. Winthrop. I've also contacted the authorities about the London connection, a Mr. Carver known for such dealings. Captain Winthrop will have questions to answer." Lydia, seated in a corner, flinched at the mention of the police, but said nothing. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the girl's clasped hands and downcast eyes. She was young, easily swayed, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, remembering a maid in St. Mary Mead who had been drawn into a theft by a persuasive suitor. "Miss Crane," she said gently, "you've done a brave thing by coming forward. It will count in your favour." Lydia's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I didn't want to hurt Mrs. Winthrop," she whispered. "I thought I was helping save the estate. Richard said it was the only way." Eleanor reached out, touching Lydia's arm. "I know, my dear. We'll sort this out. You'll stay on if you wish, and help me make things right." The solicitor departed with promises to handle the legal repercussions, and Miss Marple suggested a walk to clear the air. Eleanor declined, citing a need to rest, but Lydia agreed, and the two women strolled toward the orchard, where apple trees stood heavy with fruit. The air was crisp, and Miss Marple's questions were gentle but probing, drawing out Lydia's story. She had been recruited by Richard a year ago, his promises of a share in the profits tempting her into complicity. The silver had been sold through a discreet dealer, and the lavender scent, Lydia confessed, was her own addition, used to mask the musty odour of the passage during their clandestine meetings. "I didn't think anyone would notice," she said, her voice small. "I just wanted it to be over." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the final pieces together. The lavender had been a misstep, a small vanity that had betrayed their secrecy, much like a perfumed letter in a St. Mary Mead scandal that had revealed an affair. She reassured Lydia, urging her to focus on her future and return to the house with a sense of completion. That afternoon, Dr. Baxter called, his manner subdued but supportive. He examined Eleanor, pronouncing her much improved, and lingered to discuss the estate's future. Miss Marple, joining them for tea, noted his genuine concern and wondered if his feelings for Eleanor might one day find expression. Mrs. Gibbs, meanwhile, had begun an inventory of the remaining silver, her efficiency undimmed by the week's turmoil. The whispers, Miss Marple learned, had ceased, the passage sealed by Tompkins under Eleanor's orders. The house felt lighter, as though a weight had lifted from its ancient stones. As evening fell, Miss Marple packed her suitcase, her visit drawing to a close. Eleanor insisted she stay longer, but Miss Marple demurred, citing her garden in St. Mary Mead and a promised visit from her nephew Raymond. "You've saved Chistone, Jane," Eleanor said, her voice warm with gratitude. "I don't know how you saw through it all." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It was a matter of listening, my dear. Walls like people have their stories, and they're rarely as mysterious as they seem." She thought of the passage, now silent, and the secrets it had carried. Richard's fate remained uncertain. He had left for London, perhaps to face his creditors or the law, but Chistone was safe, and Eleanor's resolve would carry her forward. The Bentley took her to the station the next morning, Tompkins as taciturn as ever at the wheel. Miss Marple gazed at the receding towers of Chistone Hall, their ivy-clad stones glowing in the sunlight. The mystery of the whispering walls was solved, but she knew other puzzles awaited, in St. Mary Mead or beyond. For now she looked forward to her quiet cottage, her knitting, and the simple pleasures of a life spent observing the intricacies of human nature. Chapter 8. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The train from Chistone rattled through the countryside, its wheels humming a familiar tune as Miss Jane Marple gazed out at the rolling fields, now dusted with the first frost of autumn. Her small suitcase rested on the rack above, neatly packed with her grey tweed and lavender cardigan, her knitting bag tucked beside her. The mystery of Chistone Hall was behind her, its secrets laid bare, but her mind lingered on the human frailties that had woven the tale: greed, fear, and the quiet courage of confession. She adjusted her lace cap, her hands folding neatly in her lap, and allowed herself a moment to savour the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. St. Mary Mead welcomed her with its usual tranquillity, the village green serene under a pale sky, the chimneys of its cottages puffing gentle smoke. Cherry, her maid, met her at the station, her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the sombre mood of Chistone. "You've been off solving mysteries again, haven't you, Miss Marple?" Cherry said, hefting the suitcase with ease. "Jim says you're sharper than any detective in his books." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Nonsense, Cherry. I only listen and watch, as anyone might. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand house." She declined to elaborate, but her thoughts drifted to Richard's desperation, Lydia's reluctant complicity, and Eleanor's steadfast resolve. The whispering walls had been no ghostly phenomenon, but a mirror to human schemes, much like a case in St. Mary Mead, where a creaking gate had revealed a midnight rendezvous. At her cottage, the roses still bloomed bravely, though the garden needed tending, and Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with old Mr. Phipps, the gardener, about the winter pruning. Inside, the familiar comforts of her parlour, chintz curtains, a well-worn armchair, a shelf of cherished books, enveloped her like an old friend. She settled by the fire, her knitting resumed, and allowed Cherry to fuss over her with tea and scones. The village news was soon forthcoming. The vicar's wife had launched a new knitting circle. The postmistress was recovering from a cold, and young Tommy Pierce had been caught pilfering apples again. Miss Marple listened, nodding, her mind half on Chistone, half on the rhythms of village life. The next day brought a visitor, her friend Dolly Bantry, whose robust energy filled the small parlour. Dolly, fresh from a trip to London, was eager for gossip, and Miss Marple, with her usual reticence, shared only the barest outline of the Chistone affair. "It was a matter of a house with secrets, Dolly," she said, her needles clicking softly. "Some missing silver, a few forged papers, and voices where there shouldn't have been any. Nothing so very remarkable." Dolly's eyes widened, her teacup pausing mid-air. "Not remarkable. Jane, you've a gift for making the extraordinary sound commonplace. Voices in the walls. Forged deeds. It's straight out of one of Arthur's thrillers." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "People, Dolly, are the real mystery. They act out of need or fear, and it's only a matter of seeing the pattern. In Chistone, as in St. Mary Mead, it's the small things, discrepancies in a ledger, a scent of lavender, a nervous glance, that tell the story." She thought of Lydia's trembling hands, Richard's clenched fists, and the way Eleanor's courage had emerged when it mattered most. It was not unlike the time Mrs. Clement's maid had confessed to a theft, driven by a suitor's promises, or when a village shopkeeper's accounts had revealed a hidden debt. Dolly pressed for details, but Miss Marple deftly turned the conversation to the knitting circle suggesting they attend together. "It's a fine way to hear the village talk," she said, "and one never knows what one might learn." Dolly laughed, recognizing the evasion, and promised to join her, though she vowed to coax the full story of Chistone later. That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone, a letter arrived from Eleanor, its familiar crest bringing a smile to her lips. The solicitor had confirmed the forgeries, Eleanor wrote, and the authorities were pursuing Richard, who had fled to London but left a trail of debts that would likely lead to his arrest. Lydia remained at Chistone, her contrition earning her a second chance, and Eleanor was exploring plans to open the hall to visitors, a venture that promised to ease its financial strain. "You've given me back my home, Jane," she concluded, "and more than that, my peace of mind." Miss Marple set the letter down, her thoughts drifting to the passage behind the tapestry, now sealed, and the whispers that had ceased with the truth's unveiling. She felt no pride, only a quiet contentment that order had been restored. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same everywhere, its flaws and virtues as predictable as the seasons. In St. Mary Mead, as in Chistone, secrets could not hide forever, not when one listened closely. As the fire burned low, she picked up her knitting, the soft click of the needles a counterpoint to the village's evening hush. Somewhere, she knew, another puzzle waited, perhaps in the knitting circle, or in the whispered gossip of the post office. For now she was content to be home, surrounded by the familiar, ready for whatever mystery life might bring next.